Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I am Ryan Wormeli, joined today by Andrew Erickson and Pat Fitzmaurice. And fellas, we are talking risk versus reward. We're going to go through a dozen high upside sleepers and offer some best case scenarios, some worst case scenarios, maybe even some bold predictions along the line surrounding, like I said, a dozen of our favorite sleeper picks. Just a reminder for everyone that all of our 2024 consensus rankings and tiers can be found at fantasypros.com/rankings. Fitz, are you ready to jump right in?
Let's do it, man.
Let's do it. Fitz, give me your first wide receiver sleeper.
It's Jahan Dotson of the Washington Commanders, and Dotson was undeniably disappointing last year. 49 catches, 518 yards, 4 touchdowns over 17 games. But the quality of quarterbacking was pretty iffy. Sam Howell did throw the ball around quite a bit at one point midway through the season. He was leading the NFL in pass attempts, but it seemed like he was much more comfortable throwing to the middle of the field and not so much to the sidelines. Jahan Dotson was primarily working outside, and so it seemed like it just wasn't a good fit. He was kind of left out of the target bonanza that Washington had going on. And then at the end of the season, Howell completely fell apart. So just not optimal. But we saw Dotson hit pretty well in his rookie year in 2022. Missed some time due to injury, but he had 7 touchdowns in 12 games, averaged 14.9 yards per catch and 8.6 yards per target. Not bad considering that Carson Wentz and Taylor Heineke were his quarterbacks that year. Now he's getting the big QB upgrade with Jayden Daniels. On paper, the Washington defense doesn't look great, so maybe we get a lot of pass-happy game scripts for the Commanders, much like LSU had last year with Jayden Daniels, where their defense was terrible, the passing game was clicking, and every game was just a shootout. So I think the upside for Jahan Dotson this year would be that he is the Robin to Terry McLaurin's Batman. And look, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas combined for 31 touchdowns in 13 games with Jayden Daniels last year. That's not happening. McLaurin and Dotson are not scoring 31 touchdowns, but they could do 20, right, over 17 games. So maybe the ceiling for Dotson looks something like 70 catches, 1,000 yards, 9 touchdowns. But the worst case scenario, I guess, is that Daniels struggles in his rookie year and Dotson's target share doesn't really increase over 2023. It remains as low as it did last year. In which case, another year disappointment.
By the time we got to the end of draft season last year, Dotson was one of my favorite, and I think one of a lot of people's favorite kind of mid-round picks. He was a guy that, and in fact, was creeping up ADP enough that he was starting to become like an early mid-round pick and not even a guy you could get later on, because there was just a lot of helium for him in August last year. And I think it's understandable if some folks maybe feel like a little burned by that. His ADP right now, though, is in like the low 50s or high 60s at the position. That's a very attainable player for the upside that you're kind of laying out. Erickson, what do you think about Dotson?
Yeah, Dotson is one of those players where you kind of see him in the rankings, you're like, oh, I forgot about this guy because you got burned by him last year. So you're like, I can't go back to that player. I mean, he was drafted ahead of Mike Evans, right? Looking back at that, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I drafted Jahan Dotson in front of Mike Evans. But I think one of the other things that I think Fitz maybe briefly mentioned was, so Curtis Samuel is gone. And there were some splits in what was the positive part of last year, which there wasn't a lot of, but in some of this time in games that Curtis Samuel missed, you saw Jahan Dotson more involved. I know against my Patriots, he had a really productive game. I believe Curtis Samuel didn't play in that game. So Curtis Samuel's obviously with the Buffalo Bills. So unless we're expecting Luke McCaffrey to come in and command a high target share as a 3rd-round pick in the slot, Jahan Dotson, maybe now he spends a little bit more time inside alongside with Terry McLaurin, with obviously Jayden Daniels, hopefully adding an upgrade to the quarterback play.
One of the reasons why I wanted to start with Dotson is because I thought, this applies to everybody in terms of we're picking high upside sleepers, so there's going to be a wide range of outcomes. But I felt like Dotson was maybe the biggest gap between what I could see his best case scenario playing out as and what his worst. First of all, worst case scenario for every one of these guys is injury. So that's obviously excluding that. Right. It feels like his worst case scenario is lower than a lot of these other guys while having just as high of a best case scenario. Is that a fair assessment, do you think, Fitz?
Yeah, I think so. And the worst case that's part of the thing. Like, injury can derail anyone, but here it's hard to see Dotson not getting an increase in target share with Samuel gone, and the guys who could maybe cut into it a little bit are rookies. Luke McCaffrey, who Erickson just mentioned, and Ben Sinnott, the tight end. So it's hard to see Dotson not playing a pretty substantial role in this offense, I think.
Even coming off of his bad year last year, I still will never forget how badly he torched Maryland's secondary in a game I was at when they were hosting Penn State, and he's just like the greatest receiver of all time in my mind based off that one performance. Erickson, let's go to your first wide receiver here.
Well, speaking of injuries, Christian Watson. So when it comes to Watson, the worst case scenario is basically what happened last year, where the hamstring injuries just absolutely nuke him again. But even if he is healthy, now heading into last year, it was like Christian Watson versus a bunch of no-name guys and rookies. Well, it turns out a lot of those no-name guys and rookies are actually pretty good. So it's no longer, oh, Watson just shows up and he's the number one guy. It's like, oh, no, he actually has to go out, stay healthy, and earn actual targets. So even if he is healthy in 2024, the concern is, well, Jordan Love just continues to spread the wealth. He spreads the targets between Watson and Jayden Reed and Romeo Doubs and Dontavian Wicks and the two tight ends. So even though it looked like, oh, this guy's going to see 30% target share, easy, no longer the case in part of his worst case scenario heading into 2024. But best case scenario is that a healthy Christian Watson, who he may have never been healthy at all last year. Like, we won't actually know, because every time that he played, it seemed like he was going to pull his hamstring every other route that he ran. So the best case scenario is that he stays healthy, but that he does emerge as that clear-cut number one wide receiver like he did as a rookie. You know, from week 10 onward from his rookie season, he was a wide receiver 9. You know, overall in fantasy points scored. And he's someone that also has a presence in the red zone. Just this past season, when he was healthy, 13 red zone targets in just 9 games. He had 15 end zone targets during the regular season and postseason combined, which ranks 6th most at the position. So I'm not a huge believer in Romeo Doubs, to be honest. Like, I think that talent-wise, Watson is much better than him. I do like Jayden Reed a lot. I do like Tucker Kraft a lot. Talked about him as a deep sleeper. So, yeah, it's going to be tough for Watson necessarily to come in here and be the number one target in this offense. But from an efficiency standpoint, like, Christian Watson offers, I think, a skill set that not a lot of these other guys offer necessarily, with the speed and size and what he flashed his rookie year. So, again, if we can just get him healthy. Like, if you look at his last 15 games, basically, so this year, in the previous year for his rookie campaign, 13.3 fantasy points per game over his last 15 games that he's basically played like a full snap share. That's the same amount of points that Jamar Chase scored in 2023. Like, that's the type of ceiling we're looking at when it comes to Christian Watson, especially because he scores a ton of touchdowns and he's a big play threat. So Watson, to me, is one of these ultimate boomer bust receivers, and he's like one of these, I kind of view him as like a wide receiver firewall, where in rankings and ADP, he's like the last receiver I like click on, then I'm like, well, we just hit an avalanche, and now there's no other receivers I can draft with any type of confidence. Like, he's the last guy that I feel some semblance of, okay, I can see the path where he can deliver for me, but then after that, it really falls off a cliff.
Fitz, you're obviously a Packers guy. As a fan, how would you kind of rate the chances of Watson at the end of the season being the Green Bay Packers receiver to own?
I think it's a very plausible scenario that that's the case. This is a guy who in 2022 had 8 touchdowns over a 4-game stretch. And then last year he had 4 touchdowns over a 3-game stretch. Like, this guy, the only thing, and Erickson outlined this, is the target scenario is a little murky with all the competent pass catchers in Green Bay. But in best ball, I mean, getting that sort of touchdown upside, it's pretty sexy. Erickson, let me ask you, in your rankings, Jayden Reed and Christian Watson, is there a big gap between those two, or are they pretty close together?
I think I both of them have them in like that wide receiver 3 range. I know I've Reed higher just because of what he did last year as a rookie, and I liked him a lot as a prospect, and he obviously has shown that he can be a little bit more healthy. I think that his role is more concrete in the slot. So I'm just double checking right now, make sure I'm not talking out of my mouth. So yeah, Jayden Reed 38, and then Christian Watson 46. So yeah, in the wide receiver 3-4 range.
Okay.
Watson's ADP is wide receiver 43 right now in early drafts. So similar range there, but obviously with some real upside built in. Fitz, who is your next wide receiver?
Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Between Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, the Bills are losing 241 wide receiver targets. They signed Curtis Samuel in free agency, a useful receiver, but not really a high volume guy. Samuel's career high in targets for any season is 105. The Bills did draft Keon Coleman. I like Keon Coleman a lot. As you know, Worm, I'm very pro Keon Coleman. But even though I am pro Keon, I can't tell you that he's a bulletproof prospect. There's some blemishes on his college production profile. He's not an exceptional separator. And he's a second-round pick, not an early first-round pick. One of these can't-miss guys like Malik Neighbors, Roma Dunze, Marvin Harrison Jr. And by the way, I can't even imagine what it was like to be a Bills fan on draft night, where the Bills keep trading down to teams that take wide receivers. I'm sure they were apoplectic until the Bills actually took one on day two. Anyway, Shakir didn't really draw a ton of targets last year, only 45 during the regular season, but he was highly efficient with those targets, 15.7 yards per catch, 13.6 yards per target, really good numbers there. And he started playing more snaps and drawing more targets down the stretch. He had a touchdown catch in each of the Bills' 2 playoff games and a team-high 9 targets and 7 catches in the divisional round loss to the Chiefs. So I think the upside for Shakir this year would be if Coleman isn't quite ready for prime time and Samuel continues to play kind of a peripheral role, I think Shakir could lead the Bills in wide receiver targets. And Dalton Kincaid, we're expecting him to have a pretty big role, but maybe those are the 2 primary guys in this offense in the passing game. I don't think a 75 catch, 1,000-yard season is out of the question. Worst case scenario, Coleman pops right away. It turns out to be a monster. And the passing game sort of runs through Coleman and Kincaid. Shakir's once again a third or fourth wheel.
Fitz, this is like sort of a half-baked idea that popped in my head as you were talking. So feel free to say like I'm wrong and dumb and did not think this through. Do we as an industry move on from receivers too quickly now that don't break out by the end of year 2? Because we see so many talented receivers coming into the NFL every year now. And a lot of these like high-level rookies especially will break out in like the back half of year 1. And if not in year 1, it's like year 2, they've really established themselves as like a really viable fantasy asset. That I feel like, you know, I remember growing up, it used to be the notion of like year 3 was the year for receivers. And it feels like that's gotten earlier and earlier. So these guys who have talent and maybe even opportunity, like it seems like Shakir has, but who haven't quite had that true breakout yet prior to year 3, often get overlooked. Do you think that's a fair thought or is that too half-baked?
There has been a paradigm shift. I mean, back in the good Lord, the 1990s or whatever, it used to be like, yeah, target the year 3 wide receivers who, you know, they've sort of served their apprenticeship. They're ready to break out, and rookie receivers were kind of a sucker play. That's really changed. So let me answer your question with a question, Worm. Are you interested in drafting Terrace Marshall this year?
I am not. I had him actually I got him in a number of rookie drafts, you know, a couple of years ago. But he's not, you know, at this stage, it seems like clear that he's not going to take the step that I had hoped he would. And so I'm not interested in him. So I think that's, you know, a fair comparison. Erickson, what do you think about that?
Isn't Terrace Marshall entering year 4? I
actually don't remember.
Wasn't he drafted?
Is it 4?
Well, yeah. The player I was thinking about was Elijah Moore as another like player that I was on like last year entering year 3, I believe. And then, you know, he flamed out. And then, I mean, unless your name is Jerry Jeudy, basically, like, you could just continue to flame out wherever you go. And somehow, I mean, the Browns just giving out contracts left and right that they definitely don't regret. So, yeah, I think that the way that the college game has evolved, you know, that's why you're seeing more receivers hitting the ground running. And I think that teams also tell us that they're expecting receivers to produce sooner. And there's a reason why if the Bills felt so strongly about Shakir, then why did they sign Curtis Samuel? Why did they draft Keon Coleman? Like, clearly they obviously will take what they can get from Shakir, but he was still a 5th-round pick. So, again, I obviously, you know, Fitz is not saying, oh, Shakir's locked and loaded. Shakir is obviously an upside play. I totally understand that. But from the team's perspective, NFL teams can't lie to us by the moves that they make in free agency and the NFL draft. Like, they invested into the wide receiver position. Obviously, they needed to replace Diggs and Gabe Davis. But at the same time, like, what type of capital they spend does matter.
Marshall was drafted in 2021, which means he is going to year 4, which is really wild to think that.
Nobody was drafting him last year either.
Even grosser than, the point still remains, but he's even grosser than I thought. All right, Erickson, who is your last wide receiver sleeper?
I'm going to go with Brian Thomas Jr. for the Jacksonville Jaguars, first round pick. And so the worst case scenario with Brian Thomas is he ends up in Jacksonville and he just never really becomes like the focal point of the passing game, where he basically fits that better in real life wide receiver fit versus better in fantasy football, because Brian Thomas Jr., what he did at LSU, like field stretcher, deep threat, like that's what his best quality was. He was scoring a bunch of touchdowns on long plays, and that may or may not work in fantasy football, especially with the way that 2 high safeties are deployed. Like, you don't see teams just dropping back and dropping dimes all day long to score points. It works in college, but not necessarily in the NFL. So that's a concern for Brian Thomas. And also, Gabe Davis is there. They did pay Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis knows the wide receiver coach in Jacksonville. So if Brian Thomas Jr. is like losing snaps to Gabe Davis, then yeah, that's definitely the worst case scenario. Because if Gabe Davis can't get targets and he's playing ahead of Brian Thomas, then that's a big concern. But on the best case scenario side for Brian Thomas is Trevor Lawrence loves to attack downfield. Like, that is something that he loves, and we saw it last year to mixed reviews with Calvin Ridley, who I don't think is a natural deep threat per se, but I mean, a lot of those balls thrown a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, Calvin Ridley doesn't drop it, and then Trevor Lawrence's numbers look way different. So it's a scheme fit that I think works with the quarterback in place at Trevor Lawrence, who we've seen fuel fantasy producers. Even guys like Zay Jones have been productive. Christian Kirk has been productive. Ridley, again, up and down, but still had spike weeks. And I think ultimately that's what Brian Thomas looks like a lot of, is a spiked week, splash week potential player. And I think that the best case scenario with him, specifically just looking at this offense, there's over 200 targets available that have vacated this offense from the losses of both Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones. And we look at Ridley's role last year as that perimeter kind of outside wide receiver. He had nearly 1,800 air yards, 23% target share, 36% air yard share, and he was the NFL leader in end zone targets last year. Wide receiver 10 expected fantasy points per game. So if you basically just like plop in Brian Thomas Jr. and he takes on this Calvin Ridley role, you say that Gabe Davis takes on Zay Jones's role, and then Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram stayed the same, relatively speaking, then you're looking at a really productive and lucrative role for Brian Thomas to produce from the get-go. And I don't think a lot of people view this landing spot as that, but there is a path where this is actually a grandioso type of landing spot for Brian Thomas. And I think that gives him a lot of upside. So for me, I think we could see him get over 100 targets, just based on the fact that there's so many vacated targets from last year between Ridley and Zay Jones leaving this offense. And when you just look at historically, like rookie receivers that get over 100 targets, they've well exceeded expectations. So if I was to make a prediction about Brian Thomas, it would be that maybe he doesn't lead the Jaguars in targets, but in receiving yards specifically, I think that you could see that from him if he's specifically used downfield and it's just Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram eating underneath.
Fitz, I want to get your opinion on this. You know from talking with me on the Dynasty show that I'm on record as saying I did not dislike the landing spot, and I've been a little confused with Brian Thomas falling like into the second round in Superflex rookie drafts. I think he's a talented player. He was wide receiver 4 coming into the draft, and I don't think this landing spot is such that he should drop that far beyond that. That's been through the Dynasty prism, though. I haven't really considered him as somebody that I'll be rostering a lot of in redraft, and I'm not really sure I can articulate why I haven't considered him that way, because Erickson, I think, lays out a really compelling case. What do you make of Brian Thomas Fitz specifically in redraft?
I'm having a hard time assessing him too, Worm, because I think the target outlook is pretty murky. It does help that they released Zay Jones, but in addition to Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis being there, you've got a tight end who caught more than 100 balls last year. So I think Erickson kind of hit it on the head with these spike weeks, and that's what we're looking for out of Brian Thomas. And hopefully he gives you spike weeks often enough that you can consider starting him in a managed league. But I think he's going to be kind of a nightmare to handle in managed leagues, quite honestly, where you just don't know when the spike week is coming, if it's coming. And, if you start him and don't get it, are you looking at 2 catches for 23 yards?
Erickson, you are, for the record, ranking Brian Thomas much higher than the rest of the Fantasy Pros team. As of the most recent updates, which is not, updated for everybody, Debro and Fitz have him in the low 60s. You've got him in the high 30s. You've got him 39. So you are ranking him aggressively in addition to seeing the upside here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just being over bullish on first round wide receivers more often than not works out. Even last year, look, so we had 4 receivers drafted in the first round last year. 3 of them I would say were hits, and one of them was obviously a colossal bust, but that's 3 out of 4, right? That's coming out in the green. So I'm not guaranteeing that Brian Thomas is going to be a top 40 wide receiver, but if I'm taking shots like, okay, do I want to take Brian Thomas or go down the Cooper Kupp train again? Like the guy we just haven't seen the eliteness from him in a while, or a player like Deontay Johnson, where Deontay, in a managed league, you feel much better about starting him every week, but we've been down this road with Deontay where it's like the guy's going to be wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 every single week. So again, I think it's in this part of the draft in the rankings where you are trying to layer in and balance out upside versus floor, which is always hard to do in linear rankings. But that's why you come to the shows to get the analysis behind the rankings.
Of course. Everybody continue to listen to shows, please and thank you. The NFL draft is over and the teams are set. It's time to start looking ahead to the NFL season with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Get a jump start on the season with futures bets on division winners, win totals, stat leaders, and so much more. Explore the latest odds on which rookies will have the most passing or receiving yards, or check out futures for your favorite teams and players on the DraftKings Sportsbook app. I was looking over the early odds on DraftKings for the Super Bowl earlier this week. The Chiefs, of course, lead the way at plus 550, 49ers right behind them at plus 600, then my Ravens at plus 900. I don't find that one quite as disrespectful as I did Lamar having only the 5th best MVP odds. I think this one makes more sense. The Lions and Bills round out the top 5, both at plus 1200. Quite honestly, if Patrick Mahomes is healthy in January, it's hard not to like the Chiefs, even as the shortest odds, because it's Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs at plus 550. It's going to be way better than that by the time you get to January. However you plan to bet your NFL futures, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code FantasyPros. New customers bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's code FantasyPros only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Guys, let's move to the running backs. Fitz, who is your first RB in this scenario?
Chase Brown of the Bengals. No more Joe Mixon in Cincinnati. And the Bengals brought in Zach Moss. They didn't draft a running back, which was somewhat surprising. So it looks like it's going to be some combination of Zach Moss and Chase Brown. I think people are leaning towards Moss as their preferred guy in this backfield. He is a consensus Fantasy Pros ADP of RB30. Chase Brown has a consensus Fantasy Pros ADP of RB37. Moss has been in the league 4 seasons and was kind of widely considered to be a disappointment, I think, until early last year when he went berserk for the Colts while Jonathan Taylor was on injured reserve. Moss also had a really big game when JT came off injured reserve, and they kind of gave him the kid gloves treatment in that first game back. But from week 6 on, Moss averaged 3.6 yards per carry and wasn't nearly as effective. Moss he's not fast or explosive. He's not a prolific pass catcher. Chase Brown is fast, 4.4 speed. Chase Brown was good as a pass catcher last year, averaged 10.4 yards per target. I think the best case scenario for Chase Brown is that they simply decide he's better. They hand him the Joe Mixon role, and he runs with it and gives us that Joe Mixon mid-range to low-end RB1 value. And lest anyone question whether Chase Brown could handle that big a role, in his final college season at Illinois, he averaged 27.3 carries a game and 29.6 touches a game. Brett Bielema and his staff ran Chase Brown into the ground that final year in Champaign. So if you get Chase Brown in a Joe Mixon role, there is a path to RB1 upside here. I guess the worst case scenario for him is that we're just wrong. I'm wrong. And Zach Moss is, in fact, the lead guy, and Brown plays a supporting role. Although I guess maybe the even worst case scenario would be that we have to do the Undertaker GIF for Travion Williams and Chris Evans. And those guys, Travion Williams, who's been in the league for 5 years and has never had more than 26 carries in a single season. Chris Evans, 3 years in the league, never more than 17 carries in a season. Maybe those guys are going to come back from the dead and, make Chase Brown a disappointment, but I kind of think not.
I definitely see the case that you're making for Chase Brown. I wish he was going more in the RB40 range than in the mid RB30s. Like, I wish I could just get a little more value there when taking that upside swing, because I do think Moss actually looked good, just like purely the eye test, like when he was in control of the backfield in Indy last year. But I definitely see like the upside case is like clearly there, and we're talking about sleepers, not guaranteed things. Erickson, where do you have Chase Brown ranked?
So I have him right at ECR at RB37. But I have him ahead of Zach Moss, which is really the more important way to kind of distinct like how you feel about Chase Brown. Like I'm firmly on the Chase Brown side, and I think that it's super telling where there's a parallel universe out there where if Jonathan Taylor never gets hurt or has like a contract holdout, like Zach Moss isn't even on the Bengals because he's a free agent, because nobody signed him, because he didn't play at all, because he wasn't any good. So that's the thing that concerns me about Zach Moss, was he was kind of gifted. Basically, Deion Jackson had to play like the worst game possible in week 1 for the Colts, like with a 98% snap share, and just be so horrible that the team was like, all right, we got to give Zach Moss the ball, even though he's coming off like a broken hand injury. Like, we have to give this guy a chance. And yeah, he delivered with it, but we've seen Alexander Madison deliver plenty of times. But when you have to actually be the starter from the get-go and earn that job versus getting the job because of an injury, those are two different things. And that was something I tried to warn people about with Madison, where it was like, he never earned out touches over Dalvin Cook. He played when Dalvin Cook got hurt and delivered. That's different. And I think it's telling that Chase Brown, as a 5th-round rookie, earned his way onto the field with a healthy Joe Mixon. He did not get onto the field because Joe Mixon got hurt. He earned touches, and he delivered with them. So, I mean, I can only imagine when they're in practice and you got Zach Moss plotting out there, and you have this explosive Chase Brown who, like Fitz said, like, can handle a workload. Like, I remember writing that about him, where it was like, maybe I'm not so sure how explosive he was, but like his testing was really good. But I really feel like Chase Brown, the NFL, if someone's going to give him 25 touches, like, he'll do what you can do with 25 touches. And I think that's all the Bengals are looking for. And I think that when push comes to shove, they're going to get way more out of Chase Brown than Zach Moss. And I think most NFL teams are probably going to realize that.
I loved watching him at Illinois. He was a very good player that final season. Erickson, who... I
was going to say, Worm, you had your memory of Jahan Dotson destroying the Maryland Maryland Terrapins. Chase Brown just completely trashed my Wisconsin Badgers in his final season, and they just like steamrolled Wisconsin at Camp Randall that year.
Yeah, he was really good in the Big Ten that season. Erickson, who's your running back?
So this was D-Bro's RB1 last year, and now he's a sleeper. Tony Pollard. It's just very bizarre how far we've fallen from Tony Pollard being someone that we all loved, breakout year as a backup, and then gets the starting role and basically just, pukes over himself. Like, it just didn't work out for Tony Pollard last year. It's basically the worst run out that you could have. And fast forward to 2024, not in Dallas anymore. They didn't bring him back. He's on the Titans, and we're like, okay, but Tajay Spears is there. So what does his offense mean? Like, is this going to be a committee? How good is Will Levis? How good is this offensive line? So there's just a lot of question marks about the offense overall. So the worst case scenario is that Tony Pollard is what he is last year. And like, that's what he is actually as like a starting running back. And he's just not very good. He's not dynamic anymore. He's not that explosive guy that we saw when he was in a part-time role playing alongside a, banger like an Ezekiel Elliott. And then obviously the other concerns are, Will Levis entering year 2. Like, he had one good game against the Falcons and that was it. And a lot of quarterbacks that are not good have good games against the Falcons. Like, just look at the Falcons, like, defense historically has not been great. So, and then the offensive line, they've obviously drafted players to improve it, but until we see it all put together under Callahan and the new staff, you should remain somewhat skeptical that, this is going to be a top 10 offensive line. So those are the worst case scenarios with Tony Pollard. But the best case scenarios obviously start with his price tag. He's like super cheap now. And I still don't believe that he's not that same running back that was super explosive, that we were just begging for the Dallas Cowboys to give more touches to over Ezekiel Elliott, because I've hit on this point a couple times, but from week 11 onward, this is when Tony Pollard basically said, hey, I feel like myself again after he broke his leg in 2022. He broke his leg, and then after week 11, he was PFF's highest graded running back. Like, he felt much better. And although the counting stats, specifically touchdowns, weren't there for him, even though he had all the red zone touches you could possibly ask for, he just ran bad in the end zone. Like, that happens sometimes. Sometimes guys don't convert on touchdown regression. Like my guy Cortland Sutton 2 years ago with Russ, like, had all the end zone targets, did not score, and then what happened the next year? He scored all the touchdowns. So I'm trying to learn my lesson about being high on a player 1 year and then thinking back and be like, well, I was just wrong. Well, maybe I was just a year too early. And that's kind of how I feel about Tony Pollard. I think that maybe we just jumped the gun. We just wanted to kind of put him as RB1 and make he's going to be all great. And then it just didn't work out. But in a new environment where the Titans, I think that they will be better on offense. I do like the improvements they made on the offensive line. They've added a bunch of different wide receivers to help Will Levis develop in year 2. So for me, my prediction for Tony Pollard, he's going to score more fantasy points and potentially a committee role with the Titans than he did last year as the Dallas Cowboys RB1.
When you first sent me the names for this show, our producer John said that he wanted to define this as anybody outside the top 24. And I, before looking at the rankings, was about to respond and say, you messed up. You accidentally picked Tony Pollard.
No.
Like, oh, no. His ADP is RB26 and his ranking in ECR is RB25. So he is outside the top 24. I was really surprised by that. I didn't expect him to be ranked as an RB1 or anything. Obviously, like you laid out everything that happened last year. But he's somebody, if he stays at this price, I will have him on a lot of teams because I think the upside is really apparent.
The market with him is it's just back to him just being Zeke's backup. That's where he's being drafted again, when he was always more viewed as a handcuff that would always deliver when he didn't get the opportunity to do so. And I just think last year, it was just a really bad run out for him. And I don't think that we should be so aggressive penalizing him, even in a new environment. I mean, they had Tajay Spears and they still elected to sign Tony Pollard. So I think that means something at least.
Yeah, I mean, just even in looking at ECR, I'm not sure which of these names I would specifically line it up as, but some of the names that he's going around or behind: Mostert, Najee, DeAndre Swift, James
Raheem
Conner.
Mostert, 33-year-old running back or whatever, versus Tony Pollard. Imagine saying that to someone last year and they'd be like,
yeah.
Yeah, they would think you were on all types of weird things.
I'm going to be taking him higher than a lot of these guys that are ranked higher than him. Fitz, what do you think about Pollard? Are we out on an island here? Or?
No, I mean, what Erickson said at the end of his Tony Pollard spiel made a lot of sense. It kind of resonates that, yes, Tony Pollard could go back to a committee role where Tajay Spears does have a significant role to play himself. And Pollard could still be really good in that because, I don't know, people just mistakenly figured the remarkable efficiency Tony Pollard had always shown as a runner and as a pass catcher in Dallas was automatically going to travel over to a full-time role and that he'd have the same efficiency, just more volume. Didn't happen, although maybe it was the injury and, coming off tightrope surgery, not a surprise. He wasn't super effective early in the year, but I kind of want to see him go back to having that super efficient part-time role. And I don't know about you guys, but preseason's still 3 months away. The Titans are a team that I'm really going to be fascinated to see how everything comes together. Now they've got Tyler Boyd, they've got DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley. Can Will Levis make the passing game go? I can't wait to see the Titans in the preseason and start to look for clues.
Yeah, I would say I'm not excited to watch them, but I'm fascinated to watch them. I'm really curious to see how that plays out.
They may end up being so last year the over team, right? And the bets was the Colts because of just the chaotic nature of Gardner Minshew in that offense. I think that could be the Titans, where it's just Will Levis is either throwing an 80-yard touchdown or sack fumble, and it's just the other team head scores. It's because points galore and just absolute chaos.
I mean, this is the most interesting the AFC South has ever been, right? The Colts getting Anthony Richardson back and what they've added with A.D. Mitchell. Obviously, the Jags we've already talked about a bit. And, clearly CJ Stroud, like, what does he do in year 2? They added Diggs. Levis is like, if he fails, it's going to be because of him, not because of the talent around him. Like, I'm really fascinated by that.
I know.
division.
I'm just looking forward to that Saturday wildcard game with 2 AFC South teams because that's what always happens in the early window, 4:30 p.m.
It does seem like a good Colts-Titans spot this year for the wildcard game, doesn't it?
Yeah. All right, Fitz, who's your next running back here?
Oh, I was going to try to keep rookies off this list since we've been talking about rookies ad nauseum for the last 3 months, but I couldn't keep Blake Corum off this list. And it just seems like with the landing spot for Corum going to the Rams, the upside for him is that Kyren Williams gets hurt again. And Corum basically gives you the same per game production that Kyren Williams gave fantasy managers last year, which was 21.3 PPR points per game, second only to Christian McCaffrey. And while I'm certainly not going to predict an injury for Kyren Williams, he weighs less than 200 pounds and they give him a heavy workload. So maybe he's at an elevated risk. He did miss 4 games last year. So also the possibility that McVay makes this a split backfield, although, traditionally he's kind of operated with a workhorse manning a big share, Todd Gurley, Kyren Williams last year. I guess the downside is that McVay does operate that way the entire season. Kyren Williams never gets hurt, and Blake Corum doesn't see the field very often. So that could happen, but man, like a guy who is going to be drafted in the mid to late rounds and could potentially give you 20 points a game if he's ever needed. Like, I'm worth holding that guy on my roster just for that potential upside. And I'm not going to waive him at the first injury because the upside is so starry and appealing.
You don't like Corum better as a running back sleeper than the other 2 rookies that are often going ahead of him, right? In Brooks and Benson. You just see this as like maybe a better value, or do you actually like him better with the situation and the health?
I mean, his upside per game, like something would have to happen. It would have to be an event opening the door for Blake Corum, whereas these other guys, it's just the way they're going to be used, presumably. I did think Corum was the best pure runner in this class, like not super big, not super fast, but great contact balance, great vision. I just knew with the testing and everything, he wasn't going to be the first running back taken.
You had him RB1 for a while on the Dynasty Show. I forget. Did he end up RB2 for you? Is that? I forget where he ended up.
I moved him behind both Brooks and Benson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Erickson, who is your next running back?
Jaylen Warren for running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I mean, I'm going to lay out the worst case and best case scenarios right now. It's Arthur Smith walks in day 1 and it's like, Jaylen Warren, I hate you. I'm going to go with Najee Harris, or vice versa. Best case scenario is like, Najee, I hate you. There's a reason why we didn't pick up your contract extension, and I'm going with Jaylen Warren. Like, that's the thing with me. It's a matter of like who Arthur Smith is going to lean on as his preferred running back, and I don't know what that is. Like, to me, it would make sense that they would probably stay in their roles that they've had the last 2 years, where Jaylen Warren is deployed mostly as the receiving back and the more guy that you get into space as the more explosive running back. But I think that he could still see more carries versus Najee, where Najee's the banger and the red zone goal line back. But like what we saw from Arthur Smith last year, he had Bijan. He used Bijan in really, as bad as he used Bijan in the red zone, which he could do with Najee. He could flip the script and decide, I'm going to use somebody else instead. He did use Bijan a lot in the passing game, which I think could be Jaylen Warren's role, just based on what we've seen from Jaylen Warren as a receiver out of the backfield with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, and just from a rushing standpoint, Warren was superior to Najee Harris all last year, 4th in yards per carry, 3rd in rushing yards per carry after contact per attempt. So, yeah, for me, Jaylen Warren is like, he's this sub back that every year has been journey eaten into Najee Harris's workload. And Najee's gotten bailed out the last 2 seasons with strong finishes because he scored a bunch of touchdowns. But he started out slow back-to-back seasons under a new offensive coordinator without them picking up his 5th-year option. Like, they have no allegiance to Najee Harris anymore. I don't think they view this as, Najee was a first-round pick and Jaylen Warren was undrafted. Like, that doesn't matter anymore. Like, both these guys could not be on the team next year. So they're going to play the best running back. And that could be, I mean, he's based on the data and what we've seen the last 2 years. that's Jaylen Warren to me, not Najee Harris. So if Najee Harris starts out slow for the third year in a row, there's not going to be time for him to dig out of the hole. And I think that Arthur Smith is going to see that. I think that he's going to feed Jaylen Warren more than Najee Harris. So for me, the prediction here is that the gap separates more than it did last year, where they were basically tied, and just kind of depending on format, Jaylen Warren actually scored more points in PPR. Half PPR was basically a tie. But Jaylen Warren, I think, is going to be a top 24 running back, and Najee's going to fall outside the top 40. I can't see a compelling argument to draft Najee Harris based on his touchdown dependency in an offense that has so many moving pieces, whereas Jaylen Warren is the better receiver. He's a more explosive rusher. And, I mean, if Arthur Smith just opens his eyes and is like, okay, like I should probably feed Jaylen Warren the ball a little bit more, then I think that you're going to benefit more from drafting Warren than sticking to the first round draft capital that Najee Harris has had. That I think the Steelers have already shown, like, we don't really care anymore because, again, they didn't pick up his fifth year option. Now, the worst case scenario with that too is like, okay, we're just going to run him into the ground. Like, that's also a scenario too that would not work in Warren's favor. Or if Arthur Smith just decides, like, now we're just going to ride Najee because we've seen him ride the more inefficient running back before, like we did last year at times.
I don't know how many arguments you're going to win when at a certain point you say, if Arthur Smith just opens his eyes, because I think we've seen that that's not going to happen. Now, I think it would make sense that now that he's not the head coach, like, he doesn't have kind of unilateral like authority, and Mike Tomlin could come over and say, listen, this guy's better and you need to play him. Like, I'm not going to allow you to only go with Harris. But I do feel like Najee is the type of guy that, like, particularly in the red zone, like you alluded to, I could very much see that being Arthur Smith's preferred choice for getting any kind of short touchdown. Fitz, where do you rank Jaylen Warren?
Oh, man, I think he is in the high-end running back 3 territory. I want to say I've got him at like running back 26, 27 or so. And everything Erickson said makes perfect sense to me. I see the appeal for him. It's just, do I want to pay for a ticket to the Arthur Smith House of Mirrors in the Pittsburgh offense? And I just, like, I'm leaning towards not wanting to pay that admission. And like Erickson said, the one thing that the worst case scenario is Jaylen Warren basically getting the thumbs down from Arthur Smith. No, Najee is his guy. There's also the ugly scenario where Arthur Smith just oscillates wildly week to week. One week it's Jaylen Warren. The other week it's Najee Harris.
It's even worse, honestly. I'd rather just
and it's this
like...
this whack-a-mole scenario that has fantasy managers pulling their hair out all season. I could totally see that too. Well, it's ugly, man.
Go ahead, Erickson.
I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but like one thing that I've always envisioned that I would think would be super progressive for a coach to do would be like, right, like every single week they just switch off the running back they use. Like this week is Jaylen Warren. It's all Jaylen Warren. We're going to load him up. And then the next week it's Najee. And they just switch. I mean, because running backs, again, we see them being so replaceable week in and week out. It's like, why can't a coach step up and be like, I'm going to get the best of my running back if he has a full week off,
Erickson,
doesn't play at all.
Are you or are you not a fantasy analyst? This is terrible for our game. What are you suggesting here? Don't put this out into the ether.
This is what we need.
The other thing to remember with Pittsburgh is, like, I think Justin Fields at this stage is a better quarterback than Russell Wilson. And if he sort of ends up solidifying himself as the starter, then the most explosive runner in that backfield, like, might not be Jaylen Warren. It might be Justin Fields. And that might be something that Arthur Smith tries to take advantage of.
That could also really hurt Najee, because if it's like, oh, Justin Fields goal line packages, like that's what we're doing in the red zone. And that's going to hurt Najee more than hurt Warren. Because Warren, like, we're not expecting him to get the red zone work at all. If Najee loses that to quarterbacks, then he's like screwed.
Well, it's either
facets.
It's either Justin Fields is in the role and he eats into their work, or Russell Wilson is in the role and they're not good enough to score a lot of touchdowns. So I don't know how many times they're going to be on the goal line if Russell Wilson is their quarterback. So I just want to let everybody know quickly that Fantasy Pros championship drafts on FFPC, both fast and slow, are already live. $350 is the entry fee. Go to fantasypros.com/FFPC and use promo code FantasyPros on sign up for $25 off your first entry. Again, that's fantasypros.com/FFPC. It's a $1 million first place prize. It's the world's largest online season-long tournament. There is an early bird discount as well. Register by June 15th and draft your team by June 30th to receive a free $35 team credit. One more time, that's fantasypros.com/FFPC. All right, guys, let's wrap up with the quarterbacks. We're going to do one guy for a 1 QB league each, and then we'll do one guy for a Superflex league each. Erickson, give us your 1 QB guy.
Yeah, for me, it's Jayden Daniels. I know this was D-Bro's sleeper quarterback that we talked about earlier in this week, but I agree with him. Like, we're holding hands here. I have him as a top 12 quarterback in redraft because I just believe in the rushing upside. Like, we've seen rushing at the college level. It's one of the best things that translates to the NFL level. And just looking at what happened last year, Anthony Richardson averaged 60 rushing yards per game in college. What did he do in the NFL? He was running around like a madman and scored over 20 fantasy points per game. Jayden Daniels also averaged over 60 rushing yards per game at college, and that's a much bigger sample size. You know, he played over 55 games at the college level. Anthony Richardson wasn't even close to that. So Jayden Daniels, I think, too, when you layer in, I think he's more of an advanced passer than Richardson was coming out, more of a complete passer. I just think he checks off all the boxes of a late-round quarterback in a 1 QB league that just because he wasn't the number 1 overall pick, because he's a rookie, because it's Washington, it's Cliff Kingsbury that's there. Now, that's the worst-case scenario where the marriage between him and Cliff Kingsbury just is an utter disaster. And like we've seen Cliff at the NFL level, sometimes his offense gets gimmicky, gets predictable, and he doesn't adjust, and then there are issues there. But at the same time, best case scenario, we saw Cliff Kingsbury have another rookie quarterback named Kyler Murray, who was really productive at college with his legs, go right to the NFL level and win Rookie of the Year and be very productive. Kyler Murray, his rookie year, QB7 overall. And he was not passing like at a crazy rate. He was throwing for under 240 yards per game, and he still was QB7. He was QB9 in points per game. So I really just like Jayden Daniels for those reasons. And I don't think it's going to take very long for us to be ranking him consistently inside the top 12 as long as he stays healthy, which again brings up the other worst case scenario with him is he just doesn't stay healthy because of the rushing. Like, he had the propensity to take big hits at LSU, and it does not necessarily work in his favor that the tackles in Washington currently are Cornelius Lucas and Andrew Wiley, and they did not really address it during the draft. So tackle's an issue on the offensive line, and the fact that Daniels hasn't really shown the ability to, I mean, he hasn't really gotten hurt necessarily, but he has showed a propensity to take a lot of big hits, and that's not going to translate well at the NFL level. Well, the hits are just that much harder and faster.
Yeah, injury is the worst case scenario for everybody we're talking about today, but I think it's particularly worth noting it with Jayden Daniels, given that when he's under pressure, he's very likely to take off. At least that's what he was in college. And when he takes off, he's pretty likely to take a big hit. And these are now NFL-sized defenders and NFL speed defenders who are like going to hit him hard. So I really worry about that. By the way, he wasn't a sleeper for D-Bro. He was a league winner. So even kind of more praise there from the way D-Bro is talking about him. Fitz, I want to ask you on Daniels, not where you have him ranked or where you think you'll have him ranked as we get, further into draft season and into August. Where do you think consensus will have him ranked? Because right now he's QB 18. I think that's still catching up from kind of the post-draft reaction and officially seeing the landing spot and starting to really further evaluate him from maybe some of the analysts that weren't thinking about it from a dynasty perspective. But by the time we get to like mid and late August, where do you think he will be in ECR?
QB 14, QB 15.
Okay, so still
I think
the
there
top
is going to
12,
be,
yeah.
But people are going to. I think we're going to get a lot of people touting him as an upside play based on the rushing ability, and people are going to come around to that.
Will you think they'll always be behind Caleb though? Do you think he'll ever surpass Caleb in the ECR, or do you think he'll always stay behind Caleb?
I think he's going to stay behind Caleb up until the regular season. What about you? Do you have him ahead of Caleb in your rankings?
He's ahead of Caleb in our staff rankings, just not in the overall ECR amongst
because
the industry.
I think too, like, obviously we're just coming out of like dynasty rookie drafts, and I don't think that I wouldn't put Daniels over Caleb. Like, I would take Caleb in dynasty clearly over Daniels, but we're just looking at a 1 year sample size, and the rushing that I know Caleb can run too to an extent, but like Daniels has like a Lamar Jackson like level ceiling when he's playing, with the rushing component to his game. And it took all of 2 games for us to see that with Anthony Richardson. Like it like happens like that. And maybe Caleb isn't running around as much. Like maybe he doesn't feel the need to because he has good receivers to throw the ball to, right? Like Jayden Daniels is going to be running around because his tackles can't block and he needs more weapons besides Terry McLaurin if Jahan Dotson doesn't hit, and then he has a bunch of rookies. So naturally, I think we're going to see him run more and more often and more quickly, especially in a scheme that Cliff is going to use his legs. Like we've seen Cliff do this before with Shane Waldron, not so much, a little bit more hero ball when it comes to like how Russell Wilson was in that system and how Caleb Williams was, at USC.
First of all, it's blasphemy to suggest anybody has a Lamar Jackson rushing level ceiling as a quarterback.
I apologize.
He's the greatest rushing quarterback of all time.
That is fair.
I will hear no arguments to the contrary.
Right.
Second of all, Fitz, give me your quarterback in single QB leagues.
Tua Tagovailoa, and we saw both the upside and the downside last year. Over the first 8 weeks of the 2023 season, Tua averaged 20 fantasy points per game and was the QB5 in fantasy scoring. Then the downside, we got that from week 9 on when he averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game and was the QB20 from week 9 through the end of the regular season. So Tua doesn't run. He does not have the Jayden Daniels rushing upside or anything close to it, but he does have one of the best wide receiver duos in the league with Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. They've added to his pass-catching firepower by drafting Malik Washington and signing Odell Beckham Jr. So now that's a deep wide receiver room with some injury insurance in case anything happens to Hill or Waddle. And they've got all sorts of weaponry in the backfield with Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert, and now Jalen Wright. So also, the Dolphins lost a lot on the defensive side of the ball this year. Christian Wilkins, Xavier Howard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Jerome Baker. Even with those guys, Miami gave up the 11th most points in the league last year. So the Dolphins could see a lot of shootout game scripts where they need to throw to catch up, in which case we could see Tua putting up some pretty sparkling passing numbers. The downside, though, well, we know he's got the worrisome concussion history, and we know things sort of fell apart down the stretch for him last year. Tua maybe doesn't seem to like playing in cold weather that much, so we don't know if he's going to be great down the stretch. So yeah, this could really go either way. The nice thing is, like, he's being drafted as a quarterback too. So with the consensus ADP of QB 14, even if we don't know if we're getting Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, there is a reasonable case to be made for gambling on Dr. Jekyll at that price.
Yeah, I think that's a good point on the ADP. I would be, I think, pretty nervous if he was my QB1, if I was just kind of last to the train and I ended up with him as my main guy. But I'd be really excited about him as my QB2. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Let's get to the Superflex guys. Erickson, who's your quarterback here?
Daniel Jones for the New York Giants. And the worst case scenario is that Drew Lock takes over. That's what we're looking at, because that's potentially in the cards. Because everything I've been reading post draft, where it was like the Giants basically were saying, hey, if we can't get Drake May, like, we don't think any of these other quarterbacks are better than Drew Lock. Like, that's who they were comparing to, like Drew Lock or Daniel Jones. So it's like, we're going to stick with these guys for as our quarterbacks. If we can't get Drake May, they couldn't get Drake May because Patriots are smart and did not trade the pick to the Giants. So that's what we're looking at here. Daniel Jones is coming off a torn ACL in week 8. So how quickly is he going to reacclimate? And then the questions are, is he going to be running as much? Because that's what's tied to his ceiling. The best case scenario when it comes to Daniel Jones is like the 2022 season, his first year with Daboll. He was a top 12 quarterback. Like, he was good. Like, he scored fantasy points. And last year was the worst run he could possibly have. Like, he got hurt. The offensive line was a mess. And when he came back, he got hurt again. Like, it was just an absolute disaster. And there's obviously some concern with the Giants. Like, this year, it seemed like, yeah, he's going to be the starter. They're paying him X amount of money. So it's like, let's give him a shot. But it's his job to lose. And Drew Lock has been, like, pretty vocal about, like, hey, I wanted to be on the Giants because I said I could compete for the starting job and potentially win the QB1 spot. So it's a large range of outcomes when it comes to Daniel Jones. But, I mean, he's, like, buried in QB rankings. Like, I think the last time I checked, he's like QB 28. Like, so I moved him up significantly, especially after the draft, because they got Malik Neighbors, who's a receiver that I think that Daniel Jones, like, needs desperately just as an offensive playmaker that you can just get the ball to and let him do his magic. But Daniel Jones offers the stuff that we want for fantasy quarterbacks. Like, he runs. And they added weapons, and the offensive line shouldn't be as injured as it was last year. So, yes, I see the path where he can offer a lot of upside, but I also see, like, the path where, like, it's an absolute disaster, and he's, like, not even the quarterback anymore for the New York Giants. So that's why in Superflex, like, this is a guy that I'm looking at as, like, a QB3 potentially. Like, I don't feel confident, like, oh, I got to slot in Daniel Jones every single week as my QB2 for the long term. No, I don't want that. But if I need an upside in a particular week, I think Daniel Jones can offer that. So, but, you know, to kind of tie it all together with my bold prediction for him. I think that he is going to be a low-end fantasy QB1 with the rushing. I think that he's going to come back and still run, because when your job's on the line and you know that this could be your last game starting if you don't play well, like, you're going to run. Like, I don't think that he's necessarily going to try to protect himself more, even coming off an injury, but I think that ultimately he cannot fend off Drew Lock, and Drew Lock takes over as QB1, brings the Giants to the playoffs, and wins comeback player of the year, Drew Lock.
Wow, that is definitely a bold prediction. Fitz, where do you have Daniel Jones ranked? He's QB 27 in ECR. His ADP is even lower. It's actually QB 31.
Yeah, I'm above consensus. I think I'm like QB 24 or so, because he runs, which is what we're looking for, and because the Daniel Jones-Brian Dable marriage worked pretty well in 2022. So I guess I'm kind of cautiously optimistic where if you throw Malik Neighbors into this offense and maybe the offensive line is patched up at least a little bit, that it could work again.
Fitz, take us home with your super flex pick.
Oh, it's Justin Fields, and this guy definitely has to be a QB3 in Superflex since he doesn't actually have a starting job, to our knowledge, and that's pretty much the worst case scenario, that he is Russell Wilson's backup for the entire season. Best case scenario, he is the starting quarterback for the Steelers sooner rather than later early in the season, provides the usual rushing production that you get with Justin Fields, and is a competent passer. In 2022, he averaged 20.5 fantasy points a game. That's pretty much the upside with him. So, yeah, for Justin Fields, maybe I'll buy the ticket to the Arthur Smith House of Mirrors.
Well, plus you get the kick returns if you're in a league that covers those kick return yardage.
I don't quite buy the idea that we're ever going to see Justin Fields returning kicks for the Steelers. Bold prediction, by the way, I will predict that Justin Fields starts 10 or more games for Pittsburgh this year. I still think he's better than Russ.
I do too, and I think it will become I think the only reason that doesn't play out is if Tomlin is just like kind of stubborn and like, I want to take the veteran who's been there before and like wants to keep alive the streak of not having a below 500 season. Like, I think the upside is just so much clearer with Fields. Like, as a Ravens fan, I'm really hoping they start Russ as many games as possible because Fields scares me a whole lot more. Erickson, what do you think about Fields quickly before we get out of here?
Fields is 40-1 to win comeback player of the year, and he checks off a lot of boxes. Again, and he's not coming off an injury, but if you look lately at who's won this award the last couple of years, even last year, Joe Flacco, he wasn't injured. He came off the couch, but he came off a different situation. Geno Smith wasn't injured, but he kind of came off of being a cast-off. Like, who has been written off more than this past year than Justin Fields? I mean, come on. Like, that was the spiel with Geno Smith. The league wrote me off, didn't write back. And then he won the award. So, I mean, with Fields, look, and especially with how that award is so driven to the end of the season, where it's like, let's say the last 4 games, Russell Wilson either goes down to an injury or he gets benched. Justin Fields leads the Steelers to the playoffs with a 4-game stretch of elite play where he's just running like a maniac. People are going to vote for him to win comeback player of the year. And he's going to be, I mean, when the fantasy championships come around, Justin Fields is going to be the Steelers starting quarterback, and you're going to want him on your team.
I'm not like some lifetime like Justin Fields truther the way like Debro is been a huge fan for a while, but I think he's the 3rd best quarterback in that division. I think Lamar and Burrow are the only 2 quarterbacks in that whole division. I'd rather have him than Deshaun Watson, honestly. Given what we've seen recently, I'd certainly rather have him than Russell Wilson. So yeah, like I said, he scares me a lot as a fan of a team in that division. We'll get out of there on that. Thank you everybody for tuning in for our risk versus reward. Like I said, we gave you a dozen high upside sleepers, so hopefully you can hit on some of those guys here in draft season. For Erickson and Fitz, I'm Ryan Wormeli. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.